better? Okay. Good afternoon. Welcome to this seminar. My name is Cheng Xie. I'm associate professor at the Faculty of Education. It is my pleasure to be invited to give this introduction to Professor Diane Piccarelli. Professor Piccarelli is Professor Vitiso at the University of Leeds. Her work is situated in the broad area of educational linguistics. In her research, she has worked with the English medium instruction and English for academic purposes. Her current project, funded by the Swedish Research Council, explores the relationship between teachers' pedagogical skills and teaching in the EMI context. Her publications include Introducing English for Academic Purposes, published by Routledge, and Teaching to Avoid Plagiarism, published by Open University Press. She's also the founding co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of English Medium Instruction and series editor of Routledge Studies in English Medium Instruction. So we really have the right person to talk about EMI here. I understand Professor Piccarelli used to work in Hong Kong for years. So she understands the educational context of Hong Kong and Macau, where EMI has long been a dilemma. It's a focus, or if not a dilemma, for educators, especially at the secondary level, but increasingly at the tertiary level as well. So I'm sure Professor Piccarelli will bring us new insights about the EMI transition and what are the other challenges brought about by EMI beyond language. So without further ado, let's welcome Professor Piccarelli to give us her talk.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm wondering, do I need the microphone? Can you hear me okay in the back? Okay, promise me that if my voice gets too soft, you'll say something. Otherwise, I'll just, whoops, pop this away. Great, yeah, thank you so much for that introduction. And I guess I should say that actually I know quite a lot about EMI in Hong Kong. The Hong Kong and Macau are not identical. Similar in many ways, by no means the same. So there's a lot that I don't know. I planned this talk to take quite a bit less than the allotted time span. So we'll have time at the end for questions, but especially I would appreciate any comments or observations about how your experience may or may not be different from or similar to what I was writing. Let me see if I can move this. Oh no. Okay, there we go. Right, so these are the 4 areas that I'd like to cover in the talk today. So, because EMI is different in every context, we need to spend a little time, I think, on defining what we're talking about when we say EMI. And looking at this transition from L1 education to EMI, then really the heart of this talk, the question that I want to explore is what changes when we make the transition from L1 instruction to EMI. But then having done that, I think we can look at the implications and then also ask, well, what could change under different circumstances? What things might we want to change? What sorts of change might we want to try and reduce? All I did was press the arrow. I don't understand what's there we go, okay, there we go. On its face, English medium instruction, EMI, should be a pretty transparent term. It's about using English as the language in which we do teaching and learning activities. In addition, usually EMI is applied to contexts where English is not the dominant language. So if we imagine a classroom somewhere in the Midwest of the United States where every student and the teacher are first language users of English, clearly English is the medium of instruction, but we don't usually describe that kind of setting as EMI. We talk about EMI when English is not the dominant language. So we could define EMI in terms like this, a setting in which at least some participants have another L1 than English, but in which all are expected to use English for some instructional purposes, and in which English is not taught, but is nevertheless expected to be learned. So that's a pretty straightforward, canonical definition. Not many people would disagree about most parts of it, but no two educational settings are exactly alike. And that's every bit as true for EMI settings as it is for any other educational setting. And so in any two given EMI contexts, there are actually a lot of differences that a quite generic definition like this doesn't expose. So let's illustrate this by contrasting a couple of different EMI settings. So I'd like you to take a minute to think about an EMI setting that you're familiar with. It could be the program that you're studying on now, or teaching on now. But it could also be something from earlier in your educational history, or even perhaps a setting that you've learned about from somebody else's experience. So whichever context you want to think about, put that in mind for the moment. And think about, in this setting, which language or which languages are used? By who? And when and under what circumstances? So I'm just going to pause for a moment while you gather your thoughts on those questions. Chance to do a little bit of thinking about that, then I'm going to give you a sort of profile, I guess is the word, of a particular EMI setting that I know well because I researched it. So I think if most of you are thinking about higher education in the CAL as the EMI context you have in mind, I think you'll see some considerable differences, also some similarities, but I'll be really interested to hear if that's in fact the case. Okay, so the context I'm thinking about is a master's level course in business education taught in a university in southern Sweden. So here's Sweden, right up at the top of the world, right above that we can't see on the map is the Arctic Circle, so kind of as far north as you can go on this planet. On this program in business administration, about half of the students are international students, and they're from a whole range of backgrounds, primarily from Europe and Asia, but there are also some students from Africa and a number of students from India or Pakistan. And among these origin countries, the student population is really quite varied. So there might be 2 students who have the same first language, but almost certainly there aren't 3 or 4 or 5. So the international student population is quite diverse. Now, amongst the other half of the group, who are technically home students, local Swedish students, about 2/3 were born in Sweden and have Swedish as their first language, but about 1/3 come from another country, because Sweden has a really high immigrant population. So about 1/3 of these students came to Sweden at some point in their life, got some of their education in another country and in another language, and probably didn't grow up speaking Swedish at home. May or may not, depending on when they immigrated, may or may not have had an education in Swedish as young children. Local Swedes have, immigrants may or may not have done. The teacher is a native speaker of Sweden, and she really insists on an English-only ethos. So all of her lecturing is in Swedish. If a student raises their hand and asks a question, it's going to be in English. If a student comes up to the teacher after class and asks a question in Swedish, she'll probably answer it in Swedish if there's just the one student there. But if an international student is standing in the queue to ask a question, she'll insist, no, you have to ask your question in English. And when the students do group work, she goes around and listens, and if there are people using a different language, she'll really insist, no, we have to use English in this classroom. And one reason for that is that there have at times been complaints, particularly if just 1 or 2 international students find themselves in a group with lots of Swedish students. The Swedish students start speaking Swedish, the international students feel a little bit left out. So most of the teachers on this program feel like they really have to insist on only using English and really avoiding any other language being used. So translanguaging is not something they value. When class is over and the students go to the library to work on a group work assignment, or maybe they just go to the canteen for a cup of coffee, probably they're going to wind up speaking English because that is the one language that everyone has in common. So even if it's 5 Swedish students and 1 Indian student or 1 Chinese student, they're probably going to speak English because that's the common language. How is that similar to and different from what you were imagining? I've described a context where pretty much only English is used. Is that your experience here? The only language you hear from the start of the day to the end of the day is English, and you don't hear other languages? No? What other languages do you hear?
Like in Macau, like people use English during class, especially for lecturer or professor. Sometimes when we have discussion in class or we just have some random chat after class, we'll switch to Mandarin. Or there are also some students using Cantonese.
Right, okay. So you might hear Cantonese, you might hear Putonghua?
Yes.
Also, in class, when you give the students group work, you'll often get, almost always you get them doing group work in a version of Chinese, but the groups will tend to congregate where a lot of the mainland students will come here. They don't actually speak Cantonese, but some obviously do. So you'll get these language groups forming in your classroom for discussions as well.
So when students group themselves for group work, they group themselves by language groups?
Not entirely, but that is definitely to some extent.
Okay. And how do people feel about that? Do teachers kind of say, oh, that's okay? Or
You have to ask students more.
are you a teacher?
Yeah.
Well, how do you feel as a teacher? Are you happy if that group's having a good discussion in Putonghua?
I'm more or less, I'm more or less okay with it because I can usually get students to explain what it is they're talking about, or if I come by, I'll know if they're, and I do speak a reasonable amount of Mandarin, so I know what they're talking about. I don't speak any Cantonese. It doesn't, the only condition I would place on this is that I actually teach future English language teachers. So I do feel like there's a value in encouraging them to use English in the class, but it's not usually the main focus of the class. So I am fairly, I'm fairly tolerant. If it helps them learn something, then I'm fine with them using Chinese.
Great. Thanks for that. I've described a context where the students kind of take the path of least resistance and use the language that makes sense, but the teacher really feels a responsibility to uphold institutional standards and policy. I don't want to ask you to rat anyone out, but do you ever hear teachers using other languages than English in the classroom? In the classroom.
I think there are teachers and professors do some kind of code switching when they're teaching, especially when he or she has some background of like either Chinese or Cantonese. And sometimes they will try to show that they want to make them more closer to the students by using their first language to some extent.
Okay. All right. So yeah, code switching, and that's one of the effects, sort of creating ties. Right? It's one of the effects of code switching. One of the reasons people do it. So I think one of the points I wish to make with this is that in instructional settings, in multilingual instructional settings, and almost by definition, EMI is a multilingual educational setting. We use different languages for different purposes, and we actually engage in a really wide range of communicative activities. So we give lectures, we hold seminar discussion groups. Students might ask a question in a lecture, or might come up to the teacher after class and ask a question. And how they express themselves in those settings might be quite different. Asking a question in a lecture it feels like quite an on-stage moment, and you have to think about the other people around you and what they're understanding. But going up to the teacher just on your own after class, that's kind of a different thing, isn't it? We have to read about core concepts, and then we have to do writing, and sometimes often those two merge, right? Because the kinds of writing that we do at university, they're built on things that we've read. And then we have to do things like speaking to somebody because the enrollment for a certain module hasn't gone through the way it should. So there are all kinds of different purposes that we use language for at university. And therefore, the language that we use and when we use it, why we choose that language, that varies situationally. So I guess the first point I want to make is that it's really simplistic to think of English medium instruction in the terms of that definition I showed you, the language that we use for instructional purposes, because there's no such thing as one sort of unbroken, homogeneous mass of educational purposes. There are lots of different educational purposes, and language choice tends to follow those purposes. And the second observation is that because language choice depends so much on these contextual factors, but the context is different in each and every EMI setting. EMI is really a different kind of animal in every place where it's practiced. So that's important to establish for our purposes today, because it may be that I make generalizations about EMI, because I am going to try to invite you to think about EMI broadly as the global phenomenon that it is in the remainder of this talk. And that might mean a generalization about EMI that makes you think, ooh, I don't think so. That does not match my experience. That may be the case, but it will match the experience of somebody somewhere in the world. So let's move on then and look at the transition to EMI. And the first question I want to sort of get into is who's doing the transition? And we can think of this kind of from a sociolinguistic perspective, where we might think about multilingualism. Individuals can make the transition. And this may be at a certain key stage, or it may be depending on individual circumstances of that person and their family. But in Sweden, I mentioned a moment ago, it's quite common for students to make that transition when they get to the master's level. Almost all primary and secondary education in Sweden is through the medium of Swedish. Only about 25 to 30% of undergraduate programs are EMI, but more than half of master's level programs are EMI, and in some academic disciplines, upwards of 85 to 90% of academic programs are EMI. So that means if you're studying a science subject and you're going to do a master's degree, it's very, very likely that you'll make the transition to EMI at that point. In Hong Kong, where I lived for a time, it could be that the transition to EMI comes when the student has finished primary school and begins secondary school. We can also think though about institutions transitioning to EMI. And this can happen quickly, it usually happens slowly, it may even happen so slowly that the individuals there don't notice it. A couple of EMI programs are introduced and they're successful for whatever purpose was the intention of introducing them, and then a few more are introduced, and then more, and then more, and then more. And then you can wind up in a situation like the one in Hong Kong, where has been so long-standing that there's really only one university, the Chinese University of Hong Kong, that has any Chinese medium instruction, and it's the minority there. So institutions transition. Societies also make this transition by promoting EMI, and we'll look at some examples, but for various reasons at a societal level, students or societies may say, right, well, we want to have more EMI in our society, or we want to have certain other things which imply EMI. So we'll look at that in a bit more detail, but first let's think about what changes with EMI in respect to those three levels, the individual, the institution, and the society. We have the most research data on experiencing the transition from the individual perspective. In fact, we've got a really big body of literature exploring the perspectives of stakeholders in EMI. And by stakeholders, I mean students and teachers, but also lots of other groups, parents, for example, employers of the graduates who are going to be coming out of EMI, the administrative staff who suddenly have to go from helping students in their first language to helping students in English when EMI is introduced. One of the things that changes is the set of practices that students use. So, Philip Shaw and Alan Milligan in this study that's cited on my slide gave reading comprehension tests to students in an EMI program in biology in Sweden and students in a biology program in England. And when they timed the test, the Swedish students performed less well than the UK students, who were primarily but not entirely first language speakers of English. But when they removed the time limitation, and the Swedish students could take as much time as they wanted to complete the reading comprehension test, their scores were the same as the English speakers. So, what does that imply? It implies that if you're a student in EMI, you're probably going to have to spend more time doing the reading assignments. If you are the right kind of student. But we know from the work of Linda Erickson and some work that I've done with my research team that that may not be the case. That students can find that the imposed burden of using English causes them to disengage, not to read more, potentially to read less. We may see that students' attainments in terms of the extent to which they achieve the intended learning outcomes, of course, may change. So this follows on quite naturally from the last point, although that's not the only source for it. If you need more time to do your reading for a class, but there's still only 24 hours in a day, are you going to be able to prepare with the same level of thoroughness that you would if you were working through your first language? If it takes you longer to write an essay, that's the assessment for your course. If it takes you longer than L1 users of English, are you going to be able to put in the same degree of planning and attention? If you've got a background of experience writing essays and other assessment texts in your first language, and now for the first time you're doing it in English, and the expectations from the English-speaking academic discourse community are different. Are you going to have the same chances of success? Well, no. And so we know that, well, we actually don't have enough hard data speaking to whether student learning attainments are or are not affected negatively by EMI. There is some evidence pointing both directions. We don't have enough information from empirical studies actually measuring performance. We do know from a lot of the perception literature that many students either feel that they do less well in EMI than they would have done if they had studied through their first language, or at a minimum they feel that's a temporary effect, even if they ultimately catch up with learning in English. At the beginning of their studies, they may feel that they're being negatively affected. Teachers' practices change. Teachers report feeling less effective. They report needing to spend more time preparing for teaching in EMI. More time making sure that their slides, their PowerPoints don't have huge language errors, don't have misspellings. The kind of thing that they could do in their first language, they have to spend more time on doing it in English. But they also report that they are less able to be spontaneous, and for that reason need to spend even longer on a set of elaborate PowerPoint slides that will contain the entire message of the lesson, because they're not confident that in the moment they'll be able to communicate all the content. So for that reason also, teachers report doing more elaborate preparation and putting in more sort of supporting materials which they themselves have to develop. Possibly that could include things like preparing glossaries for their students, so their students can see the technical terms that are being taught, in a couple of different languages. And having prepared this sort of elaborately scaffolded structure of PowerPoints that tell the entire story, teachers report that they go through them very much in the manner of somebody reading a prepared lecture rather than speaking naturally. Teachers say, I can't tell a joke. I'm teaching in my first language. I can throw in a little bit of humor to liven things up, make everybody smile. I can't do that in English. And even if I could, I'm not sure that my students would get the joke necessarily. So teachers' practices change, and not only do teachers report this, but students also, as in the study cited on the slide, say, yeah, it's absolutely true. My teachers, they're just that much less interesting when they're teaching in English. There's also the question of teachers' roles. So, with the transition to EMI, language assumes an importance that it probably didn't have in the classroom that used the first language. Now, we have, excuse me, to some extent, divided views from teachers in the academic subjects about what their roles are. Some teachers say, I'm sorry, I'm not a language teacher. I can't help students with their English. That's not my job. I teach chemistry. I don't teach language. Not my problem. Other teachers recognize the need to engage with the fact that students are learning through a language that is not their first, and do some scaffolding and do some language support. But regardless of the position that a teacher takes to engage with language or not, there's no EMI teacher who doesn't have to think about that question. What is my role? And in my research, talking to teachers, I've heard teachers adopt both sides of that position, but I've never heard a subject teacher, apart from, say, the area of applied linguistics, I've never heard a subject teacher say, yes, I think it's my role to help students out with the language question, and I actively try to do it, and even though I'm a chemistry teacher, I feel that I am exceptionally competent at doing that. That's not a thing you hear, right? Teachers who engage feel some degree of insecurity. Teachers who disengage do so because they don't feel that they have the skills. Now, I've just described some of the downsides of EMI. And certainly it's not all negatives, but equally certainly there are a lot of negatives. People often speak about a cost-benefit equation in EMI, and whatever you think about how balanced that equation is, the costs are real. And yet, quite interestingly, despite these things that we might call side effects, stakeholders broadly continue to believe in the value of EMI. There is a very widespread belief that EMI will promote improved English proficiency, and a very widespread belief that that benefit is worth the costs that can be set against it. So if we think about what happens, what changes at the institutional level, there are a lot of potential benefits for universities in adopting EMI. As with everything else I'm saying, the specifics are highly bound to the context, right? But one benefit can be increased enrollment. So this is the case in Sweden that I've been using as a kind of example case study so far. In Sweden, higher education is very much a free market economy. Universities can educate as many students as they can attract to come to them. There are no caps imposed on student enrollments by anybody outside the university. So if you can develop a program and it's so successful that you can get 500 students registering every year, 1,000 students registering every year, the money is tied to the student. So the more students you attract, the richer you will be, the more money you will make. Sweden has a population of 10 million people. That's not a lot of people. If you stop teaching in Swedish and teach in English, suddenly your potential pool of applicants goes from fewer than 10 million people, the proportion of that 10 million who are considering university, to, gosh, the number isn't infinite, but it might as well be, right? All the people in the world who want to study and can speak English. But that's not the only kind of benefit. Sometimes there is an institutional belief that EMI programs are in some way more prestigious than programs taught in the local language. And in fact, there is some sort of relationship between EMI and university rankings. So universities might choose to pursue EMI just so that they can be seen to be part of the big league of top universities. In some economies, Japan, for example, Japan some years ago said we need more EMI, and here's a government program, and if you do EMI in a big way, financial rewards will follow. So there are various kinds of benefits for the institution. There are also potential costs, just as there are for the individual. For example, we know that the teachers are going to have to spend more time preparing. That's a cost of one sort or another. If you acknowledge that as an institution, if you say, right, you usually teach 3 classes each semester, but because you're going to be teaching in English and because that will cause you more work, you're only going to have to teach 2. That would be one way of handling it. That's a cost to the university because then somebody has to be paid to teach the 3rd class. Or you can say, oh, I'm sure you'll be fine. You can do it. You can teach these 3 classes in English. And then the cost is that you have a workforce that is suddenly working harder without any extra compensation. Ultimately, that's a long-term cost for an institution. Another cost that will always come down to money is there might be a need for some additional support. Maybe the language center has to expand its capacity so that both students and teachers can get extra guidance about working through the medium of English. Maybe the library has to bring in additional resources about how to write an assessment in English. Again, if the university does those things, there's a cost. If the university chooses not to do those things, there is also a cost, although it may take longer for that cost to become visible. I think we can really ask ourselves, at the institutional level, to what extent are costs and benefits balanced? That is, when a university decides at the highest level, we have one of these incentives for introducing more EMI, we're going to go for it, we're going to do more EMI. To what extent do those university officials think about, or to what extent are they even aware of, the potential costs? And I think we can make a broadly similar point if we look up at the societal level. So Japan, as a society, decided that it wanted more English medium instruction and created a set of policies and incentive structures that delivered a lot more English medium instruction. Sweden didn't actually pursue more EMI, but Sweden, going back about 25 years ago, put out a policy that pursued more internationalization. It said in every domain, our little country has to have lots of international ties, because that's the only way we can be strong and have a strong economy when we are a little country. So we want every sector of society to internationalize, and that includes the universities. Universities don't just hire locally, go out and recruit around the world. Recruit the top researchers in the world, and the top teachers and experts in their field in the world, and bring students in from around the world. That will create international universities. And of course, there's only one way to do that. Well, I guess there are two ways to do that. One would be to say, and we will teach the world's population Swedish to a high enough standard that they can study in Swedish. But that's not particularly realistic, is it? So really the only way to do it is to say, we'll do our teaching in English. Then, if we're only teaching in English, or if we're teaching a lot in English, we can hire colleagues from wherever in the world they come from. We can hire the best teachers and the best researchers, and we can recruit students from the entire world. So that's not an EMI policy, but it's a policy that has EMI as its direct, only possible conclusion. So what changes at the societal level is that policies of one sort or another are promulgated, and that accompanies the expansion of EMI. And then, having decided on what the objectives are, further policies create incentive structures for adopting EMI. But I think another question that we can ask critically, and perhaps even be a bit skeptical about, is to what extent are those policymakers in government ministries aware of the fact that the students that they're sending into EMI are going to need to spend 50% more time preparing for their studies, that the teachers that are going to be delivering the EMI are going to have to, again, spend more time. To what extent are they aware of the fact that not every good, capable teacher will be a good, capable teacher in English? And therefore, either universities may not have sufficient academic staff to deliver EMI, or EMI might be delivered by teachers who really are not the best versions of themselves when they're teaching in English. Are the policymakers and ministries aware of this? I don't know, and I think it's something we can wonder about. So, this is the point where I'd like to move on to talk about what ought to change, or could change, or might change if we decided that we wanted to. In some ways, I think this is the most important question of all, because it's really a way of saying, what could we do differently to increase the benefits and reduce the costs of English medium instruction? I don't have a recipe for it. In fact, I think that it's probably not theoretically possible to write a recipe for it, for the precise reason that I began with. EMI plays out differently in every single context, so there's no way to write a recipe that every university could follow, that every society could follow, that every individual could follow to make EMI successful. I do think, though, that there are three sort of principles, and I do not want to contend that these are the only relevant factors, but I think these three principles explain quite a lot of what is not working in EMI and what could work better. And the first is planning, and specifically integrated planning, joined up thinking around EMI. So again, if university presidents are setting a target that there should be more EMI, that decision has to have a clear line of follow-through. And it ought, in principle, to affect every decision made in the organization, from recruitment and recruitment processes and how teachers demonstrate that they can teach in English, or planning for some teachers not to be involved in EMI, to student recruitment, how students' proficiency levels in English are verified. I think here that's probably not one of the biggest problems you're facing, but in some parts of the world, there is an assumption that if you finished your compulsory English at school, you must be good enough in English to go on and study at university. And there's no foundation for that. So letting all kinds of practical decisions cascade down from the decision to implement EMI. If it takes more time, as we know it does, for a lecturer to deliver the same material in a second language, do we need to increase the number of classroom hours? What are the implications for that in terms of how many lecture theaters we have in the university? These are currently practical problems which are in many cases very much detached from the decision to implement EMI. And I think a better set of outcomes from EMI would be had if we had more integrated planning. Closely related to that is a need for more understanding. I posed this as a question a moment ago, but I really don't think that many university presidents understand what it means to teach through a second language because they haven't done it, or because they kind of figured it out earlier in their careers and it kind of basically worked, and that's that. I don't think that many ministries of education understand what it feels like to be a student who's in EMI for the first time. So I think there needs to be a lot, and equally, I think a lot of teachers and students who find themselves pushed into EMI don't always have a full understanding of why university leadership and policymakers have decided on this course. So I think a better set of understandings around, okay, if we're going to do EMI, why are we going to do it? And how is it going to work for every level of our organization and our society? I think that's needed. And that then leads on to the question of objectives. Because the objectives of EMI are often not explicitly articulated and often not entirely clear. There is often a kind of wishful thinking around, well, obviously there are lots of advantages to having more EMI programs or admitting more EMI students to our university. If we articulate what exactly we want to be the outcome of EMI more explicitly, more clearly, that will enable all of those micro-level decisions to be made. That will enable the understanding and then the degree of integrated planning that's necessary. But if the objectives are not stated out loud, or if different sets of stakeholders have different objectives, but they are unaware of the fact that their objectives are not aligned, then it becomes very difficult to make sensible decisions further downstream. So again, I don't offer this as kind of a recipe for making EMI work perfectly, but I do think that if we think around these three areas, we might get to a better place than we are now. So that's what I had. I'm grateful to you for listening.